Okay, well, welcome. Today's guest is Dr. Kim Chaney of the University of Connecticut. Dr. Chaney, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk a bit more about your paper in terms of how age and the age of the target changes the way we think we're going to be more likely to confront someone committing prejudice or not. But I'd like to start all of these with a more big picture question. And can you just tell me a little bit more about the research questions that guide your work?
Yeah. So broadly, I kind of think of my work as getting at how do everyday people think about prejudice in themselves, others, and society. So a lot of social psychology, right, is really focused on these really kind of scientific theories about where prejudice comes from, how people experience it. But I like to try to get into the head of kind of everyday people, right, who might have their own theories and beliefs about the way prejudice works. And I try to tie those beliefs to implications for stigma, combating prejudice, and espousing prejudice.
Okay, so yeah, I like that. We often talk in this class about big theories of prejudice who are put forth together by experts, but just as important is the way that everyday people think about it, the way that the prejudice and discrimination works and what's worth pursuing and what's not. So very interesting research topic. Can you tell us a little bit about how this specific topic, dealing with perpetrator age, came about?
Yeah, so this is kind of a weird story. I guess I had some work come out a few years ago looking at what happens when you do confront someone, right, and showing that we see a reduction in bias a week later. It got picked up by some kind of small popular press article, and the title was "Research Says You Should Confront Your Racist Grandfather." And I just thought, that's not at all what what my research was at all. They should have talked to me. They didn't. And so I just kind of always had this idea in my head, of like, well, who do we confront, right? I'm not telling people to go confront their grandfather. And I got really interested in the idea of age, how that might play in. And then if you look kind of more towards the literature, Neetha Rattan has really interesting work looking at how beliefs that prejudice is malleable makes you more likely to confront. And it became kind of clear, right, that older adults might be seen as less malleable. Some work by Dr. Becca Neal and Bethany Lassiter had that finding. So just kind of trying to put all these weird pieces together that kind of come up through popular press stuff as well as the scientific literature.
Yeah, and so I like that bit you were also saying about the perils of maybe some having your work covered in the press. You really got no control over what they're going to write there, but sometimes it can be generative in terms of making you think about new research ideas, if only to follow up with that journalist to say maybe confronting your grandfather is not the best idea.
Yeah.
So it seemed to be like the key moderator here was this idea of malleability. People are less likely to seem to confront older people because they view them as less malleable. So I know you touched on this a little bit, but just because this seems to be the key finding, can you tell us a little bit more about were you anticipating all along that this would be malleable? Do you think that there are ways of even maybe potentially changing malleability, perceptions of malleability, when people think about older adults?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. Malleability, I think because it's so strongly tied to confronting already in our literature, it was really kind of that central mechanism that we were really thinking about. But throughout the paper, we're pretty explicit. We explored, I think, like 4 other potential mechanisms related to like respect, perceived social influence, just kind of not knowing what is bias anymore or intent. And those were all kind of in there to just make sure we weren't just being kind of blinded by the literature, right? Not just following malleability because it's what the literature had already told us, right? There's a lot of other beliefs we have about older adults that might have biased this. So malleability was the starting point for sure, and it does seem to come out as the strongest mechanism. Your question about can we change malleability is really interesting. I'm not sure I've seen anything on trying to change perceived malleability of kind of another person, right? We know we can kind of change people's own beliefs about malleability of prejudice really broadly, but maybe not anything that's been done yet on kind of malleability of older adults. I can certainly imagine situations might come up, right? If you see someone who's still really active and engaged in their community, right? You might think that they're kind of still kind of more on top of things and might be more malleable, but
yeah, I was thinking maybe if you could give people evidence that older people throughout their lives have changed, they've shown malleability throughout their life, maybe then people would be like, well, they're still older, but they've shown that capacity to change in the past, so maybe why not in the future?
Yeah.
that study.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Some of the work I'm doing with Allison Chastain right now is kind of trying to tie in this kind of historical perspective, looking at like which prejudices have been perceived to be more malleable over time. Ageism is a relatively like fixed bias, but I think a lot of lay people have an idea that racism has really decreased over time, or anti-LGBTQ attitudes have really kind of changed over time. So there's certainly room to maybe tie in this like historical perspective in someone's like life course malleability.
Mhm. I was also thinking about, malleability, perceptions of malleability seem to be very important here, and older adults seem like we perceive them to be lower in malleability. Are there any other groups out there that you think are also perceived to be low in malleability, which in turn might lead to lower likelihood of confronting prejudice?
Yeah. Again, Becca Neal and Bethany Lasser have some work that conservatives are seen as less malleable than liberals, kind of just overall. And I would expect that would hold true to malleability about prejudice beliefs. So I could certainly see someone saying they'd be less likely to confront someone they know is very conservative. And maybe malleability would play a part in that, right? Like you don't think they're as likely to change their beliefs, although I think there's a lot of other mechanisms in there as well that might be more important.
Or what about like teenagers or something like that, right? We kind of have a cultural stereotype of teenagers as being really stubborn. Don't tell me what to do. Do you think you maybe would get similar effects if it was like the target was some sort of really self-righteous teenager? I'm saying this class full of many of them are teenagers, but they'll get mad at me later.
You might find something like that, right? If you have this really strong like stubbornness belief. I could also see though people view teenage early adulthood as like this really critical time for change and growth, right? This idea that people get much more liberal in college, right, is part of that kind of malleability belief. I think around young adulthood. So there's probably competing mechanisms in there, but if you gave a specific teenager who had a history of stubbornness, right, then you might see really kind of clear malleability fixedness effects.
Another thing that I found was really interesting in your results was that you did a nice job of setting up your studies so that you had targets varying in very discrete units of age. I think it was 22, 42, 62, and 82. I was most intrigued by the fact that you still found differences between a target that was 62 years old versus 82 years old. People more likely to confront a 62-year-old versus an 82-year-old. I forget the exact age of your participants, but let's say they're probably in the 25 to 30-year-old range. And my own perceptions of people of that age is that they don't see much of a difference between 62 and 82. It's all just old at some point. So I guess I want to have your own thoughts. Did you think that you were going to find differences there when you started the study? And really, what do you think explains the differences that you found between 62 and 82-year-old targets?
Yeah, I think it's a great point that a lot of kind of work on ageism, right, just lumps people into these kind of younger adult, middle adult, and older adults. But there's so much variation when we do these like 40-year categories. And so, when we started, I was kind of like, all right, who's an older adult? And I was like 65. And Allison Chastain's an expert on ageism, and was kind of like, Kim, we got to think bigger, right? There's a lot more nuance into these categories. And so when we ran our first few studies looking at that 62-year-old as like the older adult, we were finding these pretty small effects. And we were like, all right, well, if we go older, certainly maybe people will have kind of bigger effects, right? They'll be seen as even less malleable. So I think we did expect a bit of a difference between the 62 and 82-year-old, although I personally expected the 62-year-old to still really differ from that 42-year-old, which wasn't always the case. And our participants, I think, were like 35, 40. And I think one of the things that, kind of stands out to me is like, who do I know in my life that's 62 versus 82, 42, right? I think anyone could do this exercise. And I think there ends up being a pretty big generational difference, right? It's 20 years. Like Joe Biden is 80 years old, right? Kids in college, their parents might be, anywhere from 40 to 60, right? So we're approaching into that middle age. And I think there's a big difference between someone that you might be thinking about 20-year age gap. That was a rambling answer, but I think
No, I like that as an explanation. At the end of the day, maybe they're all older, but if you can map that onto the difference between a parent and a grandparent, then that kind of can mean a lot to participants, right? I like this idea that you can connect it back to an exemplar. from each one of those groups.
Yeah,
Make a lot of
definitely.
sense.
If you think about in the workplace too, right? 62-year-olds are often still in the workplace, right? We're not quite at that retirement age. So even, our participants who are 40, 50, right? They might be working with people who are 60, 62 years old and not be seeing them that much different from an 82-year-old who's likely out of the workforce at that point.
Okay, so that's another potential mechanism here. It's about contact. You actually can think about a 60-year-old in your life mostly, and it varies for a lot of people, but chances are, unless you have a grandparent that you're close with, you're going to be less likely to have a lot of intergroup contact with people who are 80 years old above.
Yeah, exactly.
Unless you
We're
work in the
pretty.
White House, I suppose, but
Yeah.
um, so another thing I wanted to ask you was whether you think these effects are very consistent to the current time period that we're in, or are we in a, yeah, we in my class have talked about how there might be reasons why age-based tensions, intergenerational tensions are particularly high at the moment. Rise of the okay boomer meme, for example. But do you think, if you had your time machine, if you went back 50 years ago, and if you were to go into the future 50 years, that you would find similar results, or do you think it's particularly true of right now?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think there's two parts to this, right? One is like confronting. Has that changed in the last 50 years and will it change more? And the other part is the kind of ageism part and this idea about malleability. What we do find in our paper kind of interestingly is that younger adults are way more likely to say that like confronting is kind of a norm. It's something that they would do much more than middle-aged or older adults. And I do think there is a norm shift happening around confronting. Don't have data to it, but I certainly think people are kind of more willing nowadays to speak up and call out bias when they see it than they were 50 years ago. And I hope that trend will continue. And the ageism part, I would think it's probably been there 50 years ago. I think it maybe looks slightly different, but I think there's always been this kind of view of, I'll just say an ageist attitude towards older adults, right, who have been kind of consistently mistreated, in our healthcare systems and workplaces in the past and today. And, I think ageism is a relatively static bias. I think it changes form a little bit. We now have an okay boomer meme, right, that we didn't have 50 years ago. But I think those sentiments might be around for a while, unfortunately.
Okay. Yeah, it'd be interesting to, set your Google clock for 35 years from now or something to run this study again to see if there's some sort of irony here where it's the people who are most comfortable with doing the confronting right now, your younger participants, when they're there, now they're the older target. Now people are just seeing them as being, it's less weird. It makes less sense to confront them because now they are also perceived as lower in malleability. But you're right, there are also these generational shifts in that the younger people right now are much more comfortable or willing or interested in confronting prejudice. So we'll just have to see if that carries over time.
Yeah.
Are there any other interesting future directions for this line of work that you have planned out for the moment?
I mentioned a little bit some of the work we're doing is trying to look at kind of this historical shift in norms about bias and perceptions and the malleability of bias kind of over a time course. Kind of pulling on some of the work by Jen Richardson, Michael Krauss, and others, looking at kind of this historical idea that we've reached or are achieving more progress, and whether those beliefs tie into our kind of understandings of malleability and malleability for people of specific generations. So we're doing some of that work. I also think there's just so much room to play around with malleability beliefs and confronting. So much of the work is just if you view prejudice as more malleable, you're more likely to confront, right? But clearly there's other beliefs we have about malleability that are kind of related specifically to the perpetrator. Our own beliefs about malleability, say when we get confronted, right? Like what happens then? I just think it's one of these kind of lay beliefs that's so integral to how we understand and interact with others around prejudice. But there's a lot more room for us to grow and understand it.
Yeah, meta malleability. How malleable are your thoughts on malleability? I think that could be a pretty fruitful line of research. So you'll have to come back later and tell us more about it. Okay, my last question is, I like to kind of zoom out on these things. Is there a question or an issue or topic within the field of intergroup relations or prejudice and discrimination more broadly that you think is pretty understudied and that you'd want to see a lot of progress on in the next 5 to 10 years?
It's a good one. It's kind of all comes back around to what I study, right? Is I think the field's done such a fantastic job building these really elaborate theories, right, about where prejudice comes from, how it operates, how it plays out, how we experience it. But I think sometimes we forget that the people we're studying, right, are people, right? We move past the behavioralists, right? No one's studying mice anymore. We're studying people who have their own theories and beliefs about the way the world operates. And I think if you went and asked, 20 different people that you see on your walk home or something where they think prejudice comes from, they're going to give you pretty different answers. So I really think this kind of returning to the people we're studying and thinking about how their own beliefs are shaping their interactions and their understanding of the world is really critical for us to take this kind of really social perspective.
Yeah, it reminds me that we're fortunate to work in a field where everyone is at minimum an amateur social psychologist. We all have ideas about how people work socially, and whether those line up with what the actual experts say is important to know about, because those are important beliefs that people have for how they interact with the world. So, well put. So thank you again for your time, Dr. Chaney. It was a real pleasure. And thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Enjoyed it.
Okay.